Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, first of all, let me just say that for those of you standing in the back, there is an overflow room across the street at the Equad Cafe area, and there's free pizza. So if you're hungry and you don't want to stand up, there's an alternative. You can still hear
free pizza. Can we go there too?
But you can do that. So, anyway, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Vint Cerf. I'm the Dean of the Engineering School here at Princeton. I'd like to welcome you to Princeton and welcome you to the Engineering School and to this very special event this afternoon. 40 years ago this month, an article was making its way to publications in a journal called the IEEE Transactions on Communications. This is that paper. And it would appear in print 2 months later, in May, 40 years ago. It was entitled A Protocol for Packet Network Intercommunication, and it described the key protocols that would later be known as TCP/IP, which are basically the rules by which the internet runs today. The paper's abstract started, and I'll read it here, a protocol that supports the sharing of resources that exists in different packing switching networks is presented. And that's basically what we have today, and when you're on the web, the internet is doing that for you, running these protocols. Now, the inventors of TCP/IP and the authors of that paper are with us today, Vint Cerf and Robert Kahn. As two of the fathers of the internet, they have made many contributions to the development of one of the most impactful technologies of modern times, needless to say. They've received numerous honors for their impact of their work, including the U.S. Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Medal of Technology. Also, quite recently, they received from Queen Elizabeth herself the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering, the first Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. So we're really grateful to have them here today. Thank them for their visit, not only to celebrate the 40th anniversary of this paper and the birthday of the internet, if you will, but also to share their perspectives on this development and what's going to happen in the future. So now I'm going to ask my colleagues, first of all, Jen Rexford, who's the Gordon Wu Professor of Engineering and also Professor of Computer Science here at Princeton, is going to introduce Dr. Cerf. Ed Felton, who's fittingly the Robert Kahn Professor of Computer Science and Public Affairs, is going to introduce Robert Kahn. And then another colleague, Meng Chang, who's the Arthur LeGrand Doty Professor of Electrical Engineering here at Princeton, will describe something about the format of the lecture today. So again, thank you for being here and enjoy the afternoon.
It's my pleasure to be here and to introduce Vint Cerf. So Vint Cerf is the Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist for Google, and also President of the ACM, which is the main professional society in computer science. In addition to his many wonderful contributions in inventing the internet, he's also been a wonderful steward of the internet for many years and in many ways, particularly as part of the board and chairman of the board for the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, ICANN, and also as the founding president of the Internet Society, ISOC. Vint is also known for his deep and abiding passion for wine. And one of the greatest pleasures of my professional life to date was celebrating after the winning of the Turing Award, which is the kind of the Nobel Prize in Computer Science, the ACM Turing Award, and had dinner with Vint and Bob after they won the award. And my favorite moment was Vint opening a 1988 Boucastel and taking a first sip and having the most delightful expression on his face, and then handing the glass to me to have the second sip. And so I'm very glad to be the one here to introduce him today, and I'm delighted to hear their remarks.
As Vince said, I have the privilege of being the Robert Kahn Professor of Computer Science and Public Affairs, and for some reason I've been asked to introduce Robert Kahn today. Bob is, of course, along with Vint Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet. He was educated at City College of New York and Princeton University. He spent time on the faculty at MIT and then went to work designing some of the very early internet hardware before it was even called the internet. He moved on to DARPA at the Department of Defense, in which he started something called the Internet Program. which turned out to be influential. After a distinguished career at DARPA, he moved on to found the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, where he's currently the president and CEO. Bob has won pretty much every award that a computer scientist can win, and they're listed in small print here. But really, I think the creation of the internet and Bob's whole career is the classic example of what can happen when great technology comes together with great public policy, the tremendous impact that it can have. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from Bob and from Vint about that topic and about their perspectives today.
Thank you.
Bob and Vint, thank you so much for spending a day on Princeton campus today. It's fantastic to have these two visionary pioneers celebrating the 40th birthday, a particular birthday of the internet. It's got a few birthdays, but this is one of them. And the format we're going to run today's event was suggested by Bob and Vint themselves, that they will give a fireside chat with virtual fire, a lot of intellectual. Well, we'll have this conversation, a dialogue going on, and there is no need for moderator. They will start talking, and you will see the magic. However, 40 minutes later, I will come back here to interrupt with that conversation to open the floor to questions, but I do have a few lead questions from colleagues, faculty, and students who told me they would love to hear your thoughts on things such as perspectives on internet's past evolution in the last 40 years. Like, what is this internet? What are the common misconceptions about internet among the public? What are the importance of design principles like interfaces, modularization, and virtualization? How did you come up with that 1974 paper anyway? And how long did you take to write that paper? And any other kinds of twists and turns in the history of this evolution where it could have gone down different paths? And topics on the future of internet and its impact in our society, such as privacy of user data in the age of big data, Internet of Things in the age of always connected, free access to the internet globally, and the spectrum policy and broadband coverage in the United States. There's a lot to talk about, and it's a pleasure to welcome Bob and Vint.
Thank you.
So let me kick it off, and I can just have one reaction to your comment. It feels like my oral exams here as a PhD student, where here are these 40 hard questions. You have 5 minutes to articulate your answer to the satisfaction of the faculty.
I would actually like you to start with explaining to people how you started working on this notion of open networking, because you were doing it while you were still at Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, even before you got to ARPA, and that was sort of at the core of this internet idea. So where did that come from?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Let me lead into it, though, Vint, with one observation for the audience here. A number of years ago, I gave a lecture at the National Academy in Washington on the internet, and it was to an Intel science search, or maybe it was the Westinghouse, where all these kids, 15, 16, 17 years old, are all there competing for the finals. And this one young lady who was the spokesman for the group got up at the end of the talk and thanked me very much. I mean, I give full credit to Vint too, and she said, you know, the work that you did is so important to us. We use the internet every day, but we have one burning question. And the question was, how did we manage to convince all the governments of the world to let us build the internet? This was a real question for them, because this is the world they live in now. If you tried to go out and replicate what Vint and I did back then, you probably couldn't do it, because it's too much understood in too many places, and there are too many other issues associated with it. But I said back then, you're not going to like my answer. And I said, except for maybe Vint, myself, and a few others, nobody thought this was a good idea. And you might find that hard to believe now, since it took up so much, had so much uptake, but the reality was nobody really thought it was a good idea back then in terms of business opportunities and the like, and so we were given pretty much a free rein. I've got a lot more stories about that, but let me deal with the question Vint put on the table. Back in the time frame when we started working on the internet, in fact, even before that, we were in a world that's very different from today's world. Big personal computers didn't exist. They were shared and they were very expensive. The personal computer, as you know it, didn't exist at all. Most of the conversations that we had with some of the big companies, even though I think they were probably described improperly at the time as didn't understand or whatever, or didn't appreciate, they weren't business opportunities. You might have had 100 companies that could connect to a network. It just wasn't a business proposition. So, you know, an organization like AT&T was perfectly happy to sell us digital lines and, you know, take the money to the bank. But the question was, you know, how do you make them work together? That was an interesting research idea. By the time I had gotten to DARPA, we already had built the internet. And I was involved in the design of that. We had many involvements from the universities around the country. DARPA paid for it. And it was so successful that in 1972, after we did the first public demo, they invited me to come into the office. I ended up running it.
This is a public demo of the ARPANET.
Public demo of the ARPANET. Today, most people tend to think of the internet as a network, and I don't. And I've said that, in fact, here at other previous conferences, so this may be old hat for some of you. But to me, the internet is a set of protocols and procedures for connecting lots of different components. And it's taken, you know, many, many years for people to really appreciate the full power of it, but it's scaled by a factor of 1 million over its lifetime. I think there is no other technical invention I can think of that's had that much scalability over the course of its lifetime. That's because it's about the protocols. It's not about the underlying networks. And therefore, anything can be part of it. It was one of the very first designs that was agnostic about the technology it was dealing with. So it's got a shot at working for a very long time in the future. Somebody may come up with a better idea. There are people here on the campus who are thinking about lots of good ideas. Maybe one of them will be of that form. But I think what we did back then was a design at a level that let lots of things happen underneath, and they have. So new networks, we went from 300 baud, 2400 baud, we're up in the billion bit range. Maybe we'll be in the trillion bit range, and yet the protocols continue to work. So the idea of the internet was, if we've got multiple networks of different kinds, and we already had one for sure, and when I got to DARPA, I led the charge to build a second one. It was called Packet Radio. For those of you who know about today's cellular world, it's really a kind of a precursor, but has the same basic functionality as a CDMA network has, direct sequence spread spectrum, if that means something to you. We didn't even have micros when I first started it. The Intel 8008 came out during that process. We ended up using the first 16-bit micro when we actually built it from National Semiconductor. Terrible architecture, but it was the first one out, so it wasn't really, by modern standards. So we had a radio net, we had the ARPANET, we had essentially a satellite net to Europe that we built on Intelsat 4, mainly to get around some of the limitations of snaking lines from machine to machine and being in accordance with the European standards that CCITT promulgated. So you've got these 3 different nets. The challenge that I was dealing with, how do you make them work together? I had some ideas about how to do that. But ultimately...
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought that you had actually written some of your ideas for open networking even while you were still at BB&N and even before the packet radio and packet satellite networks had gotten started. Now, maybe I don't remember that right. But
okay, if you want to tease that out. There's a fellow named Bob Metcalf who was well known for his work on the Ethernet when he was at Xerox PARC. And he did a thesis at Harvard, I think, in 1973. And he cited a memo that I wrote at BB&N that unfortunately seems to have, it's in the same place as the original internet paper that you took off. So it's somehow either shredded or disappeared or whatever. I can't find it. It was called Communication Principles for Operating Systems. And what it was an attempt to describe how to bring the computer into the world of networking more than had been the case originally with the ARPANET. Now, Vint was very involved in the protocols for the ARPANET, which were called NCP. And it basically treated the network, he may have a different way to describe it, but I would say as a kind of a peripheral to the computer. You put your stuff out and maybe it'll get to where it's going, and if it doesn't, it's probably an error. Push the reset button and try again. But I thought, if you're in the world of packet radio, you get interference, you could be behind a mountain, you could be in a tunnel, things might not get through, and those old protocols wouldn't work right. Besides which, if something showed up, in an errorful way, you want to be able to detect that. I thought error control was going to be important, and none of that existed in the ARPANET days. So that was sort of what was driving me down that path. But that paper was sort of the driving force behind my motivation to get involved. Then we have these different networks to try and put them all together. So that's what I think you're referring to.
So one very interesting observation is that ARPANET let us demonstrate that multiple operating systems could be made to interwork. I mean, for a long time, it was, if you had two different brands of computer, there was no way to get them to talk. So the ARPANET demonstrated first the effectiveness of packet switching, and second, the possibility of making disparate kinds of computers with different operating systems interwork in some reasonable way. The problem, though, is that it was one network, and we relied, when we wrote the host-to-host software, on the underlying network's reliability. We made the assumption that packets would be successfully delivered, and if there was an issue, they would be retransmitted by the network. And when Bob came to visit me at Stanford in '73, after he had gotten to ARPA and I had gone up to Stanford, he started describing these other networks, the packet radio net and the packet satellite net. And you could understand the motivation for doing this. If the military or the Defense Department was interested in having computers in command and control, using computers in command and control, they would need to have computers on board ships at sea, they'd need them on aircraft, they'd need them on mobile vehicles, in addition to having them in fixed installations. And of course, if you try to use wires to connect the ships together, they get all tangled up, and the wires don't work for the airplanes, and the tanks run over the wires, and so you needed radio in one form or another. So these two additional networks were pretty important from the perspective of utility. And so when Bob started describing this problem, he said, we have to deal with the fact that these networks have quite different characteristics. They have different data rates, they have different packet sizes, they have different delays. Satellite is a lot more delay than the mobile radio. The topologies of the radio net are not fixed. All of them have the possibility of losing packets and not knowing that they've lost them. Sort of like Ethernet is just a dumb coaxial cable at that time, and if you transmit something and it collides, it's gone. So the question is, how do we build a reliable system? And that led us to what we can now call the internet problem. How do we hook these different nets together? And over the course of about 6 months, from March to September, we managed to solve the problem. And in a very interesting way, we constrained ourselves so much that I think the solution sort of just popped up. We said, can't change the networks, can't go in and make them know that they're part of the internet, because they're there, they're running, they have their own protocols and routing algorithms and everything else. And this led us to recognize that we needed something to connect the nets together. We called it a gateway because we didn't know they were supposed to be called routers. So we called them gateways, and their job was to be able to speak to the other networks and encapsulate internet packets in the format of each of the nets they were passing through. Second, we didn't want any of the computers in any of the networks to have to know anything about the topology of the net, how many different networks there were, what paths the packets were taking. And in order to make that work, we had to invent a global identification for the termination points of the network, and that's where the IP addresses, Internet Protocol addresses, came from. One other thing before you should hand off, or I should hand off to you, but the one kind of embarrassing thing that happened is that while we were doing this work, we were trying to figure out how many termination points would be needed in this experiment. And we had just gotten this very successful ARPANET off the ground. It wasn't exactly cheap. It was a national scale. Actually, it even touched, by this time, Europe. as well. And so the question was, how many different national networks would there be? And we guessed there would be 2, because they would be expensive, but there should be competition. And then the question was, how many countries were there? And we didn't have Google to ask. So we guessed the 128, because that was the power of 2, and that's what all programmers think in. So 2 times 128 is 256, so that's 8 bits. And then the question is, how many computers would be on each network? And at the time, most of the computers, as Bob points out, were big time-sharing machines that served anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 people. But we were pretty generous. We said, how about 16 million computers per network? I mean, that ought to cover a pretty national scale thing. So that's 24 bits. So that's a 32-bit address. And when you do the math, it's 4.3 billion terminations. And we thought, well, that ought to be enough to do an experiment. And I always thought that if the experiment was successful, then we would probably go back and revisit this design and do a commercial, production version of it. The problem is the experiment got loose. And so you're using the 1978 standards of the internet, using what's called IP version 4. And we did, in fact, run out of that 4.3 billion address space around 2011. And instituted a new version of Internet Protocol called IP version 6, which had been defined in 1996 in a panic when we realized, remember, 96 is when the dot boom is happening. In a panic, we're thinking, my God, we're going to run out of address space. And so we designed this 128-bit address space for IP version 6. That's 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses, which is a number only the Congress can appreciate. And we turned that on officially on June 6, 2012. So now we are entering into the 21st century internet with IP version 6. Over to you.
So I have a couple of remarks. Number one is having carefully thought through this idea about addressing. It was, I think, something like a month or 2 before we ran out of network address space, because the Ethernet got introduced by Xerox PARC, and so suddenly, instead of having 8 bits worth of network that we had to deal with and 24 bits worth of host, we now had thousands of networks potentially that we had to deal with. And so fortunately, we were able to do that, and we kept flywheeling a bit, over time.
Reinterpreting the 32 bits in different ways, yeah, that's right.
Well, so, in fact, you didn't end up with the full set, because even though we had 8 bits for, let's say, Class A networks and 16 bits for Class B and 24 bits for Class C, which sounds like a good idea, you still had to figure out whether you were Class A, Class B, or Class C, so you needed to disambiguate which of those you were, so you didn't quite get the full panoply. But in any event, this was a very interesting development back then for us. But the internet itself had a couple of points about it that I like to make. One is that people thought security, was something we failed to identify up front. Bottom line is, we thought very hard about security. I met with all the folks trying to get them to build it in. This was not on their priority list. To take major defense resources and focus them on a little experiment didn't make any sense, so they put it off, and then people have often come back and said, we just didn't take it into account. In fact, security is as big an issue today as it was back then, and it's not a technical issue, it's really a policy issue. So that was number one. The second thing I would point out about the internet itself is, and I think this was a mistake that we made, it wasn't a big mistake, but it's a lesson that I think I learned, and probably Vint did too. All the decisions that we made about addressing in the early days of networking were at the level of the technology of the day. So in the ARPANET, we did addressing by the wire that the computers were connected to. So if Princeton happened to be on the ARPANET, it would have had some wire number, essentially an imp and host number, and you'd send it to that wire, because what was on the other end but that machine? UCLA was number one, so you sent, number one was UCLA. It was a little table that kept track of all these names. But when that wire then went to another network, how are you going to tell the other network what to do with it, especially if it was for someplace else? And that's where the IP address notion came from. So we had a way of addressing things globally. But again, it's about the technology of the day. in terms of reference, and I'll say what I mean about that in a moment. And then when the web came along about 20 years later, they addressed information in files by concatenating the name of the file with the name of the machine or the IP address of the machine to form what's called a URL. Imagine that you're at some point in the future, 50 years from now, 500 years from now, and you've got your information stored somewhere, and somebody says, oh, it's on the machine that used to be on wire 1 on the ARPANET. Probably don't know what that is or what wire 1 is, and the computer for sure is gone. If it said it was on the machine with this IP address back in 2014, you might not know what that is, and the same is true of things. And you get a lot of these 404 address things. So the idea that occurred to me back in the 80s when Vint and I were working together at CNRI was, instead of identifying something about the technology, let's just identify the actual information you want. So if you have a piece of information and it's stored in some structured way, then give it an identifier. If you can maintain that identifier in a persistent fashion, and I think that's something we can do, then if you came back in 50 or 500 years and said, give me the piece of information for which this is the identifier, then no matter what the technology of the day is, you should be able to find it. So that's, I think, something, if we had thought about it back then, would have been nice to try. I don't think we were there yet. I don't think the computing field was able to support that. We didn't have the global buy-in needed for it, but that to me is an important attribute. Other than that, the development of the internet really takes 2 tracks going forward. Track number 1 is the technology track, and many of you have followed it. People are trying to reinvent it today. I mean, I think the notion of clean slate internet, which people have put on the table, is as impractical as clean slate society. There's just too many investments around the world, too many things that have to change. What we can do is come up with good ideas, introduce them, fit them into the existing fabric. The good ones will take off and grow, maybe virally, maybe more slowly, and the old ones will die away. And there'll be ample opportunities for competing business and other social factions to sort that out. But the other track, which is every bit as important, and which is what I think sustained the internet in the face of international agreements to do something else, were all the social structures, of which there were many. And I would say it started out after Vint and I at DARPA back in the 70s with something called the ICCB, something called the IAB, something called the IETF, something called the Internet Society, and eventually something called ICANN, and maybe a few others. Vint was key to that. CNRI played a major role in most of that. I'm not going to talk about the role either I played or that we played, but he was a principal in that. And so let me leave it for you, Vint, if you choose to, talk a little bit about the social evolution of what sustained the internet over the years.
So I'd like to do that, but I do want to come back and argue with you a little bit on the security point for 2 reasons. First of all, because this was a Defense Department system, even though it was being designed and built and frankly used by academic environments, computer science departments, by the time 1975 rolls around, and we're 2 years into this program, by 1975, we're starting to actually implement the TCP/IP protocols that had been specified by December of actually TCP was specified more fully by December of 74.
Which also included IP within it.
IP was
embedded.
It hadn't been separated out until 1975.
The functions were embedded within TCP.
But the protocol was not separated out from TCP until 1977. Let's watch it. But the point I'm trying to make is that by 75, I'm still at Stanford, we're starting to implement the protocols. Bob had let contracts with Stanford, with both Baranek and Newman, and University College London. So an important little side note here is that this was not a purely U.S. activity. There were other parties. I had people from France, from Japan, from Norway in my laboratory at Stanford. So there was an international component to this. But I was also working with the National Security Agency by 1975 on the design of a secured system. And the problem is that the technology that was used at the time was classified, and so I couldn't share with any of the rest of my academic colleagues what the details were of that, the technology that was used to implement a secure design. But there's evidence of that work because RFC 1108 speaks specifically to IPsec, which is end-to-end security, end-to-end cryptography at the IP layer. And I think that got issued around 1979. But the second thing is that transport level security comes along out of the World Wide Web, which, by the way, is celebrating its 25th anniversary of the paper that Tim Berners-Lee wrote in 1989 today. So when I was, by this time, at MCI, we went to Netscape Communications to acquire something like $7 million worth of licenses for their browser and server software. And we got into a big issue about security. And the net effect of that, no pun intended, was transport level security, SSL, software security layers. And that was done by Mark Andreessen. By the way, cookies came out of that too. I was concerned. We were building an MCI mall way too early. I mean, this is like 1994, should have been 2004. But anyway, we were trying to build this application. And I was worried that it was going to scale dramatically. And I didn't want to have partial transactions sitting on my servers that never completed. So I said, why don't we store all the partial information about the transaction on the computers of the users? And that led to the design of cookies. So if you hate cookies, don't blame me. Mark Andreessen did that. Now, to come back to the institutional question.
But before you go, I just want to make one comment, which is the point I was trying to make was that the issue of security was clearly visible to us back in the early 70s. And we couldn't get traction for any substantive part of it. What we ended up doing was getting agreement to have the folks who deal with crypto loan us some crypto boxes, which we then packaged with a red box and a black box and built something called a private line interface, which was used initially for point-to-point encryption on the internet. That was as far as we could get until they discovered that if you did a 5-bit bypass, it might work for them, and so you could address 32 things on the other side. My point was not that all of these problems weren't solved. They weren't solved, that's for sure, but it wasn't for lack of interest in trying to solve them.
So, well, now that we're digging around in history, let me also bring up the fact that after the PLI work was done for the ARPANET, a new project called Black Crypto Red was done, building a box with a black side, red side, and a thing in the middle for internet. And so that led to something called Blacker, which is an operational system that is used by the Defense Department. So anyway, I want to come back to your point about institutions. When this thing got started, even in the ARPANET days, one of my, our colleagues, Stephen Crocker, who's now the chairman of ICANN, incidentally, was the lead on the network working group to develop the host-to-host protocols and the application protocols of the ARPANET. And he and I and others, John Postel, for example, were graduate students at UCLA. And Steve's approach to this was a very humble one. He said, anybody who had a good idea ought to be able to participate in this. And so he set a tone for inviting involvement, inviting participation and contribution to the ARPANET project. And I frankly adopted that whole cloth in the Internet project, starting with the International Network Working Group. And at one point, around 1979, Bob and I are both at ARPA, and Bob said, if you get hit by a bus, who's going to know what's going on in this Internet thing? Because he's now busy running the office. And so he suggested that we should set up a working group of some kind in order to make sure there was a place where knowledge could be kept about the project. So we created the acronym that he mentioned, the Internet Configuration Control Board, which we made as boring sounding as possible so nobody would want to be on it. And then we picked the people who were the leads in the research program that was generating the Internet design to become members of that.
Actually, that was the approach that you took to try and make the original Wizards version of the Internet real. My proposal was we set up a kitchen cabinet reporting to you at that time so you could tell them what was in your head, since I had handed off that whole thing to you. You didn't like that idea, as I recall. And so you said, but let's put together a group that'll help me figure out how to configure the Internet. And so that's where the ICCB came from.
I turned the chairmanship over to David Clark at MIT, who became the Internet architect after I left ARPA in 1982. But the thing that is so interesting about all this is that institutions have been created in this internet environment at need. And I think this is a very important thing to understand, especially when we start talking about things like internet governance. So we create institutions in the internet environment as they are required. So ICCB was the first shot at it, then the Internet Architecture Board that my successor, Barry Leiner, created. Then the Internet Engineering Task Force and the Research Task Force were created. And then as the government interest in this grew, eventually ARPA's interest diminished and the National Science Foundation became a primary sponsor of the National Science Foundation Network, which was intended to connect 3,000 universities around the US. And in order to do that, they created intermediate level networks so the people who ran the backbone network wouldn't have to deal with 3,000 different universities. They only had to deal with a dozen intermediate level networks. So this structure emerged out of the National Science Foundation's stewardship of the program. And at one point, while Bob and I are at CNRI, we're hosting the Secretariat for the Internet Engineering Task Force under a contract from NSF. And Steve Wolf, who was a graduate also of Princeton, and at that time was at NSF, informed me that he didn't think that he should spend any more research money on the Secretariat thing because the internet was now becoming a commercial operation. So this galvanized me into figuring out how the hell are we going to raise money to run the Secretariat. And the result of that, after some discussions with Bob, was to invent the Internet Society. So that got created in part to support the work of the Internet Engineering Task Force. And generally, I think also to cater to the notion that out of an expanding internet would emerge a kind of society that would be a consequence of the internet's existence, which is why the name Internet Society seemed appropriate. So the codicil on all that, of course, is that while all this is going on, John Postel is still being the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. He's responsible for Internet address assignment, for domain name allocations, and for managing the RFC editing function for all the documentation about the Internet at USC Information Sciences Institute, until one day the people at USC became very nervous as they watched this whole process become more and more commercially important. They started to get nervous that John's responsibilities would lead to liability. And so they said to John, you need to figure out how to export this out of the university environment into a place where we can't be sued.
I think there was a proposed lawsuit for the .xxx domain.
I don't even want to hear about that. That happened on my watch. So John began the process of trying to export this whole Internet Assigned Numbers Authority function, and it became quite a mess because the domain name system by this time was now commercially of interest because people were paying for registrations of domain names. And you could see people with dollar signs in their eyes, and eventually it got to be fairly frantic during the Clinton administration, and so Bill Clinton handed this to Ira Magaziner and said, fix it. So Ira picks up the problem around 1996 or so and is trying to figure out how to export this function into the private sector. Out of all this turmoil comes the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. So the rationale for telling you all this history is to say that we are going to see a continuing evolution of institutions coming out of the existence of the internet. We're not done yet. The Internet Governance Forum came out of the World Summit on the Information Society in 2003, 2005, and there were bound to be others as well. And so the constellation of institutions and organizations, companies that are involved in the internet will continue to evolve. And so we have to learn how to adapt to the governance requirements that are imposed upon us by all this dynamics.
So there's been a seismic change in the internet, structurally in the social side of things, about once every 10 years. So if you date the original work to, let's say, 1973, we first wrote that paper. By 1983, it was now out in public and commercial, and the IAB now became the body that had the responsibility. And then 10 years later, here's the Internet Society showing up. And then 10 years after that, we have all this World Summit stuff and the world's buying into it. And now we're 10 years beyond that, and who knows what the next step is. But, throughout that whole process, I think the ability to be reactive to events and create the structures that you need has been critical. You look at, say, the United States as a country, and ask, how did it evolve? It wasn't like somebody had a grand plan for the whole country. They had principles. We had a constitution. We had some structural guideposts, some North Stars, if you will. But the actual government itself has changed pretty dramatically, and we have departments now we didn't have before. We have, more states than we had back then, but the country has been able to evolve. And the internet has many of those same attributes of an evolving corpus of capability around the world, and I suspect we'll continue to see it evolve. Exactly what it'll look like, I don't know. We keep getting questions about, tell us about the future. And my view is always, well, what kind of oracle do you expect to opine upon that? There are the ones that are really good at connecting lines and doing recursive analysis or regressions or something. So they plot the dots, plot it out, go out 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and that's what it's going to look like. So that kind of person will tell you more broadband, more wireless, more information management, more information access, maybe more interplanetary, which is one of Vint's main interests. But the real driver of what happens in the future is probably the discontinuities. It's the things you don't know about, you can't plan for. And so if somebody says, tell me what is going to happen, that's about as an interesting a task as discovering undiscoverable errors. You just can't get there. And so who knows what it'll look like. Somebody may come up with a great idea. It might be somebody in this audience. It could be virtually anybody around the world at this point, because there's a lot of interest in it. But that's probably what's going to drive the internet the most. I mean, look at the companies that are thriving today. They didn't exist 40 years ago for the most part, with a few exceptions. I mean, IBM seems to land on its feet no matter what. But what about all the other companies that were thriving back then that don't exist? Google didn't start until what, 1998?
That's right.
Amazon's a fairly newcomer. Yahoo, a lot of these companies that showed up in recent years, weren't there before. And even Microsoft is struggling to figure out what's its role in this new world. Maybe they'll figure it out, maybe they won't. But serendipity is really what's critical here. You just need to keep your eyes open. It's a famous saying that chance favors the prepared mind. You just got to be open for the ideas that are going to make a big difference.
So, Bob, that makes me think of a couple of things. Sometimes people will say that they're very surprised by something happening. And I think it's fair to say that things don't happen until it's possible for them to happen. And so sometimes this is a question of economics. Sometimes this is a question of absolute capability to do something. Right? The invention of the integrated circuit in 1958 triggered an enormous sequence of events, none of which could have happened if this notion of integration had not been demonstrated. So in the case of internet, there are things that have happened to it that are partly a consequence of the economics getting to the point where it's possible and reasonable to do something. So the mobile phone, by the way, is a really interesting example. Marty Cooper is the guy that invented the handheld mobile for Motorola. It was a big 2.5-pound device with a big whip antenna with about a 20-minute battery lifetime.
Which they call the brick.
The brick, that's exactly right. So Marty explained, though, that the fact that it was only 20 minutes of battery lifetime was okay because it was so heavy you couldn't hold it up longer than that. So he did this in 1973, but it took him until 1983, all kinds of legal issues and competition with AT&T and everything else, to actually get to the point where the cell system could be turned on in 1983, which is simultaneous with essentially the turning on of the internet. And so these 73, 83 timeframes are really quite fascinating to me. But then we get to Steve Jobs and the iPhone, and what happens at that point is that a device which is more than a telephone is now feasible because it has computational capability, it can run software. And it's a fortuitous evolution because the mobile phone, or I should say the smartphone, has a lot of capability all by itself, but it also, all the applications, generally speaking, rely on the fact that those applications can get to servers on the internet and make use of them. So the two are mutually reinforcing. The mobile gives you access to the internet wherever you are, and the internet gives horsepower to the mobile phone and its utility. So one way to think about how the future might unfold is to start looking for things that are too expensive now, but what might get cheap enough to become available to the general public. And if you think just a little bit about the things you use every day, like a printer, there was a time when a computer printer was so expensive that only institutions could buy them, like the Xerox printers were experimental. What was it called? EAR, experimental something or
The
other.
Xerox
And
graphics printer was the first one we bought. We got them to take their fax machine, put a network front end on it, and we actually used it over the ARPANET for printing in DARPA.
So these things eventually get to be cheap enough because the economics have changed, the number of devices built, learning curves and everything else. So if you start thinking about things that are too expensive for users now, and ask yourself, what happens if the cost gets down to the point where it could be available to the general public? What will be the consequence of that? 3D printing is an example of this. The cost of a 3D printer used to be tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now they're $1,200 or less. And people are beginning to explore what it means, not to ship a part, but to ship the design of the part and then make the part at the other end. Now this changes all kinds of interesting things, including the delivery of the raw material that's needed for the printer. So now we have a whole new dynamic. I'm not shipping parts that have been made somewhere, manufactured somewhere. I'm shipping the raw material so the parts can be made. Somebody told me that they're going to send a 3D printer up to the International Space Station in order to make spare parts for things that are no longer manufactured. And I think, boy, that leads you down some interesting paths. So my suggestion, if you're trying to think about what might happen in the future, is to look at things. Let's take MRI scanners, for example. Those are big, very expensive things. Now think about the possibility that we really get to the tricorder. There are other medical instruments that are available now that would have been unthinkable before. Things that, well, like Google has just recently announced a contact lens which is capable of measuring the amount of glucose in your tears in the eyes. Now, there's not much glucose and there's not much liquid in the tears of your eyes. This thing is designed to take tiny samples, measure the glucose level, and then calculate how much glucose that implies is in your blood. And if you're a diabetic, instead of having to prick your finger 4 or 5 times a day, you now have this data on a continuous basis. And so now not only are you learning, avoiding having to stick your finger, but you're now getting a track of how well your metabolism is working. And with other instrumentation like Fitbit and things like that, you're beginning to get a much better picture on a continuous basis of how your vital signs are, how well your body is working. So this continuous observation, I think, is going to be another trend in the internet environment. So sensor networks will be part of our regular environment. So that's how I would approach this question of how to predict what's going to happen.
So is this Google Glass in your eye? Is that what that means?
Yeah.
Or you got wireless in your
Actually,
lenses?
I'm really excited about Google Glass for one reason. It's the first time I've seen a very convenient, look, it's no different. Think about Google Glass, it's like strapping your mobile to your forehead, but it's a lot more comfortable. It allows the computer to see what you see and hear what you hear, and the result is you brought computing power into your environment so it has context. So my favorite scenario, which we can almost do, is the blind guy who is wearing Google Glass and wants to talk to a deaf guy who's wearing Google Glass. And the question is, and the blind guy is a German speaker, and the deaf guy is an American Sign Language. Says, well, what happens? So the blind guy says, Guten Nachmittag, ich heiße Vint Cerf. Good afternoon, my name is Vint Cerf. Of course, the deaf guy can't hear that, but the Google Glass microphone hears the German, transliterates into text, translates the text into English, and displays it in the Google Glass video. So now the deaf guy is responding by signing. Of course, the blind guy can't see that, but the Google Glass camera sees the signing, translates the signing into English, translates the English into German, speaks the German in the bone conduction speaker in the blind guy's Google Glass, and so now they're communicating. Now, we can almost do all that except for the signing part, which is pretty hard. But I think it's a matter of time and engineering before we can do that. So I get excited about bringing computing into our orbit where it's part of our conversations.
So, there's an expression that's been bandied around a lot by many people. Information wants to be free. Many of you may have heard it. It's
John Perry Barlow.
John Perry Barlow and others. But the fact of the matter, it's a very misleading comment, because when you get a group like this, if we were to have this discussion here and I say, oh, information wants to be free, does that mean I can access your bank account? Does that mean I can access your medical records? Does it mean I can access classes? Those are all off. So what's not on the table then if information wants to be free? The examples that I think are going to generate these economic alternatives that Vint talked about are where information can be pretty easily and freely accessible, or at least at very low cost. And I can give you some examples. We're seeing some pretty radical potential changes in medical care, just simply because it's now going to be easier to get access to medical information, diagnostic results, to share it. And we haven't solved the problem fully, and the biggest problem I worry about is interoperability of lots of different systems around the world and how we evolve them over time. I think we're going to need the same kind of social structures that we had with the internet, and that's just one example. But if you can get the cost of certain information down low enough, it opens up all kinds of potentials, and people just don't know where to look. So, if you look at one of the reasons why Google has been so powerful to many people is it allows them to easily access, at almost no cost, things that would be very hard to do otherwise, like tax forms without going to the local area to get tax forms, court results that you don't have, geographic data. You name it, it's sort of all there at your fingertips. You don't have to go to Washington or some special place to get your hands on it. Well, if you can get medical data of different kinds pretty easily the same way, suddenly what kind of businesses are going to show up that will be able to leverage that in some way that provide you better healthcare services on the go, at home, wherever. I think that's an area of real interest. Of particular interest in this group, I would think, is that those are rather business-oriented ventures that tend to be more visible. The papers in their business section tend to report about who's doing well, making money, and so forth, where the future is in that sense. They tend not to talk so much about the nonprofit sector, the more social-oriented kinds of things. But for people in the audience that want to participate in that, you're going to have to be able to figure out how to translate what you've learned in your educational experience into actionable items to figure out how to go make an impact in the global marketplace. One of the things that the educational system is great at is teaching people the fundamentals of certain basic fields. One of the things that is really hard to convey, because if everybody understood it, it would probably have no value, is how to make money in the global marketplace. The idea of taking an idea and turning it into a revenue stream or monetizing it in some way. Vint mentioned the domain name system. The domain name system was provided freely by the government for years and years. I was in DARPA when we made the selection. I think you had just left a year or two before for MCI at that time, but it had been in the works for a while. So here it is, it's free, anybody can use it. Today, I don't know what the real numbers are, but I'm willing to wager that there must be hundreds of billions of domain names under the GTLDs, maybe 200-300 million or more, and who knows how many under the country codes. And if you figure out what the average price is for those, do the multiplications, you're talking about billions of dollars that go into that field today. So these are revenue producers for people who may never have thought about producing revenue from that before. It took a little bit of help from the government to get there, to be sure. There was a lot of opposition. One of the people who was key to that is a fellow named Mike Daniels, who was at SAIC and actually bought Network Solutions. This was a company that was later I don't know how much they paid for it, but it was much small compared.
They
small.
paid about 15 or 20 million for it.
And then they sold it to VeriSign for 21 billion.
That's right.
A very short time later. So sometimes just sort of knowing how to navigate that field. Mike just wrote, is really important. Mike wrote a book recently. He just kind of been advertising it in the Washington area. And says how he, made the internet, how he monetized the internet was basically the subtitle of that. So sometimes you can be looking at things straight in the face and not understand that there's value in there. And exactly how to take that and figure out that you could get lemon juice out of this lemon is something that they don't teach in schools. And it is probably the key thing in understanding how to make businesses work in the private sector. Who knew that Google was not the first one to advertise search services on the internet? Anybody remember Lycos? Anybody remember Alta Vista?
Yes.
Why did those guys get blown away by Google? Google learned how to monetize advertising in a very effective way. Now, part of that was maybe due to good algorithms, and I don't know everything that went behind it. Probably Vint doesn't either. But for whatever reason, it really worked, took hold, and those others are now gone.
Actually, I can say one of the reasons that it did work is that the advertisements were more relevant to what users were clearly looking for at the time. So the AdWords mechanism said match up somebody's ad with what people were searching for, and the relevance made a big difference.
The work that was done by Sergey and Larry at Stanford, they were working for Jeff Ullman at the time, and part of it came from the funding that we provided them, was to develop this page ranking relevance. Mm-hmm. And that was the reason they were able to post these ads that were relevant so that people would be more likely to click on them because they had a good method behind the scene for serving up those ads.
Well, wait a minute. There is a small little detail here.
I'm on dangerous
There are
ground
two
here,
different
guys.
things going on at the same time. One of them is developing the index of the World Wide Web and doing a page rank algorithm, more complicated now than it was before, to say which pages should be shown. Mm-hmm. Separately from that, there's this giant bag of ads, and we run the same set of search terms against the ads to see who it is that is trying to associate their ads with those words, and we let them run an auction. Then we pull those up. So those are separate and independent actions.
But those were the innovations that made it
Oh, I
succeed.
completely agree with that. Although everybody tells me, I never click on any of those ads. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, somebody must be clicking on them because we just did $50 billion a year worth of business.
Maybe Google is clicking on
I don't
them.
know. Well,
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt this fascinating conversation because we do want to save some time for a question from the floor. And I apologize that those in the overflow area over in Equad, we cannot hear you actually. Hope that you have been able to hear us. And by the way, I was told that it is completely filled as well. It's an open space. So I don't know what exactly filled means. Probably it goes to somewhere around Rutgers. And all the free piece has gone, if that's what you're thinking about.
does this mean we're supposed to go away now?
Well, calm down. There's no fire or anything.
Is there a little
Can
control
somebody
thing?
please turn this light back up, please? We don't need such a romantic environment for Q&A session.
This is actually pretty amusing.
Well, we have two graduate students holding mic. You cannot see them, of course, but there you go. It's still too romantic, but nonetheless, at least
That's the
they can
emergency
see you.
lighting.
So if you could raise your hand, they will walk down the aisle and give you the mic. Then please limit to one question and make sure that is a question rather than the general comment. Let's see how much time we have for this. Maybe 10-15 minutes. That's okay with Bob and
Whatever
Mint.
works for you.
Okay, great. There we go.
Okay, here comes the first one right there.
Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for your comments tonight. My question is to Dr. Cerf. The internet's primarily a 2D environment today. What do you see as the path, and if you have a sense, the timing of the transition to a 3D capable internet? And by that I mean when an average person can relatively easily view 3D images without cumbersome plugins.
Okay, I'm not sure I heard all of that.
He wants to know when the holodeck is going to be around, so you get a 3D
Oh, the
environment.
holodeck. Right. Okay. So.
Three-dimensional object.
Right. So.
Because you can see it today. The question is for the average user without plugin.
It's one thing to present three-dimensional images, and that's quite achievable now. It's another thing to make them palpable in the same way that the holodeck is, and I think we don't know how to do that at this point. It's really attractive to try to figure out whether it's possible, but right now I think the best you can do is visual. You've seen caves. They're pretty clumsy. It's getting better. I've seen some very nice things in the automobile industry with multiple lasers that are able to project a 3D image that you can walk around and see. And as far as I know, that's probably the next phase of video. You can see some 3D stuff now, but it's pretty weak on the video screens. I'm much more interested in seeing holographic projections. And I think we'll get to the point where we can dynamically change the holographs fast enough that we can actually do full motion 3D.
I would pose the counterpart question, which is how much of your time in the future, for you or everybody else, do you want to spend connected to this electronic world versus time you want to yourself, with your friends, your family, maybe just playing on the golf course, the real golf course?
So I have a homework assignment for you, though. This is for everybody who is interested in what Bob just asked. There's a story called The Machine Stops. It's written by E.M. Forster. It's about a society which lives in homes and no one leaves their homes. There's a machine that feeds them, that lets them communicate with each other and everything else. And one day, the machine stops. And the question is, what happens to that society? That's worth reading. You have a question.
Is there a reason during this discussion thus far that you fail to recognize the contributions and role of former Vice President Al Gore?
There's always some schnook that asks that question. That would be you. Look, Bob Kahn and I wrote an editorial on this subject at the time that Al was being crucified and misquoted. He said he was answering the question about his service in Congress as a senator. And remember, he was a senator during the 1980s. So he was asked, what was involved in the internet, and he said he took the initiative in creating the internet. Now remember, he's talking about this in 2000. And the internet that he was talking about is the one which is commercially successful. So he was involved in helping legislation happen that allowed commercial use of the government backbones. So he actually helped twice. Once in funding the NSFNet, National Research and Education Network program, and the second time was allowing the government backbones to be used in a commercial way to show the private sector that there was a real market out there. So he really deserves some credit.
If you Google the thing, you can probably find it in one of the first half dozen PageRank citations. But what we said was he was the first elected politician to articulate the importance of the internet as a vehicle. And that number two, he helped with the fundraising, both in the Congress when he was a senator and in the White House afterwards. In fact, he was very interested in these issues when he was a congressman, and I had dealt with him for a number of years back then when he was still a representative. So, I think he got a bum deal on that, but it was a political blunder, I think, and I think he would recognize it as such. I remember I was sitting in a board meeting out in California at the time, and got a call from Air Force One, and it was not from him personally, but from his staff, and they basically said, just want to let you know what happened here, and you're probably going to get some calls from the press. And I got about 200 calls from the press in the following week, and they all had basically the same question. Because if you know about the press, they're trying to make a story out of something. Their job is to sell newspapers as well as report the news. But anybody in the audience care to guess what the question was? Basically the same question from all of them. Anybody have a thought?
How do you feel about that?
That's essentially they wanted to know if I was angry.
Yeah, that's exactly what, the same thing happened to me. CNN showed up with a camera in my office and said, this is what was said about, or this is what Al Gore said, doesn't this make you angry? And by
Really?
sheer,
I didn't know that.
well, so by sheer happenstance, I had a photograph of Al Gore shaking my hand in the Roosevelt Room in the White House after Bob and I had received the National Medal of Technology. And I said, no, I'm not angry. Al is my friend and he helped us. And I remember that piece of video never showed up on CNN.
Why did you ask that question?
Just because, I worked at Bell Labs at the time, and, there's so many different contributors out there, it's so hard to recognize them all. But, certain people did play a lot of key roles along the way.
Okay.
Well, in fact, with regard to the internet, there is an enormously long list of people who have contributed in one way or another, either because they developed things on top of which we built, or who have built things on top of the things that we built. So the Internet Society has an Internet Hall of Fame, and it's beginning to sweep people in to recognize their various kinds of contributions. But you're quite right. At this stage of the game, tens of millions of people have contributed in one way or another to the Internet we have today. And I'm sure that that number will just keep getting bigger. And the thing I love about this is that it's possible for them to do that. I mean, when you create a design and an environment and an atmosphere where people are welcome to explore, contribute, and share, it's pretty amazing what happens.
I had a conversation with a very well-known author named David McCulloch a number of years ago. And the question I posed to him over dinner was, this was in the context of Al Gore's role, and would people in the future understand that he really didn't start it technically, but he showed up on the scene, like maybe within 10 or 15 years, and from the point of view of history, that looks like it's contemporaneous. So I said to him, when do you consider the end of the beginning of the start of America? It's an interesting question, because, I often sit in an audience that people will talk about decisions that the inventors of the internet made way back when, or ARPANET inventors. And I know they're just reading what was in a journal article somewhere, and it was wrong. So the decision to pick this particular checksum was based on such and such. Well, I made the decision, and that's not why I did it. I did it for other reasons. And so if you're sitting in the audience, you raise your hand and say, no, that's not right, and you're the one who did it, maybe you got a little more authority than if you're having a conference 200 years in the future and you're working off a history book. So I said, when do you consider the beginning of the internet of the country to have ended? He thought for a few seconds, and he said, well, it would probably be on the date when power transferred from Washington to Adams, because at that point we thought the nation would survive. He's a really good historian. I said, yeah, but from within this context, these guys were all around for a long time. You couldn't have a discussion about what the forefathers meant when they wrote the Constitution if they're all in the room with you, right? You just couldn't have that. So he said, that's actually another interesting way to think about it. From that perspective, it was probably July 4th of 1826, because on that date, within hours of each other, the last two survivors of that era, which was Jefferson and Adams, both died, without knowing that the other one had died, of course. Was one died first and the other one didn't know about it.